Good morning, everyone. It's 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. My name is Julie Defoe. I'm the International Marketing Manager for Go West Summit. Thank you for joining us for today's session, Managing Visitation to National Parks Within the Constraints of the Pandemic. Go West Summit is delighted to present this session with the support from IITA. A few housekeeping items before we get started. You have been muted by the host, but we encourage you to use the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to communicate with each other. We will be taking Q&A at the end of the session. Please enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All education sessions will be recorded and posted to our website so you may view on demand later. As IITA's longtime education sponsor, Best Western Hotel Group is hosting today's education session. Allow me to introduce Lisa Culley, Associate Director of Leisure Travel, North America for Best Western Hotel Group.
Everybody, thanks so much for your time and commitment this morning. It's great to be back here with Go West. Lisa Simon is the CEO of the International Inbound Travel Association, which is the only trade association focused solely on international inbound travel to the United States and representing inbound tour operators through its advocacy and services. IITA members are the leading US-based inbound operators that drive international trade business to the United States. Lisa is also the principal of the Simon Connection, which specializes in association management, strategic planning, and tourism development. She has spoken on global and domestic travel industry trends throughout the United States and around the world. Please give a warm welcome to Lisa Simon.
Thank you, Lisa Culley, and thanks to you and Best Western for your ongoing support of the Go West Summit and IITA's education programs. As a longtime title sponsor of IITA's Summit education program, we're delighted to keep our partnership going through these virtual sessions as well. And thanks to Go West Summit and to Mary Matzenbacher for the opportunity to again collaborate on Education Week. Education and open dialogue among industry players is one of the pillars of IITA services, and today we're going to continue an ongoing dialogue that we've had on travel and tourism and our national parks. We've been leading these sessions for the past several years at Go West to keep the industry apprised of developments and its impact on groups and international travelers. In recent years, there have been a number of issues, not the least of which was the proposed CUA program for commercial tours a couple of years ago, which has been set aside for the time being. But the national parks continue to be challenged by insufficient funding for the ongoing needs for maintenance and repairs necessary to protect the parks and preserve them for the enjoyment of generations to come. As the industry, it is our job to make sure that we keep advocating for that funding, and we saw a major accomplishment last year with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act that should begin to chisel away at that $12 billion backlog of repairs and infrastructure. On top of that, there are new challenges with the pandemic as the National Park Service and individual parks, like all businesses and destinations, have struggled with quickly adapting to health and safety protocols of the CDC and local health officials. Some parks have limited group and vehicle sizes or the number of tours permitted, and some are considering timed entry systems to help manage visitation levels. We've had several conversations at various levels, and we've been very pleased with the responsiveness of the National Park Service to the industry's input to better understand how tour and motor coach operators work and how logistics are affected by certain policy decisions. We may have a ways to go in tackling all of the issues at hand, particularly as we're still in the midst of this pandemic, but we have had healthy discussions and we want to share some of the progress that we've had today. We have a distinguished panel to provide an overview of some of these challenges, the issues they present for the tour industry and international visitors, and how we're working collectively to develop solutions. Allow me to introduce today's panel. We'll start with Kurt Rausch. He's the Chief of the National Park Service Commercial Services Program. He is responsible for overseeing development and implementation of national policy and programs for approximately 500 concession contracts, 6,000 CUAs, and more than 100 leases providing visitor services in national parks, ranging from multi-service lodging resorts to backcountry guides and tour bus operators. Welcome, Kurt. Vice President of LaBus, Dennis Kopiak, has worked in transportation since 1980 with more than 30 years, specifically in the charter bus industry. Dennis built LaBus into one of the largest charter bus companies in the West and certainly has significant charter business into many national parks. Marco Yan is the Vice President of Operations for Destination America, which manages all group vacations in North and South America for Trafalgar, Insight Vacations, and Luxury Gold, among other brands. He's held a number of positions with global tour operators and has vast experience with national parks tours. Michelle Michalowicz is owner and CEO of Western Leisure that specializes in customized group tours to national parks of the West. Michelle started her career working in a summer job in Yellowstone that turned into full-time positions in their group tour department. So national parks visitation certainly seems to be part of her DNA. Kurt, we're going to start with you so we can get an update from the National Park Service. Can you discuss the lessons learned from 2020 in dealing with COVID and share how parks have adapted and what policies and processes have had to be reshaped?
Sure, thanks, Lisa, and thanks everyone for inviting me today. Really excited. One of the benefits, if there's any silver lining to things like COVID, is the fact that much of the Park Service, at least the headquarters staff, is operating remotely and using things like Teams and Zoom to participate in meetings that were sometimes more difficult for us to get to before. So thank you, Lisa, for reaching out and allowing the opportunity to talk a little bit. Certainly, COVID-19 was a challenge for the National Park Service. As we started to experience it in February and then moved through last summer, there was an awful lot that the Park Service had to learn in terms of how to manage on the fly. And as many of you that are listening know, our national parks are kind of a unique environment. They're not a single monolithic type of organization. We have parks that are in urban areas. We have parks that are in exceptionally remote areas that are only even available by aircraft to get to. And then everything in between. And we are also located in all states. And that means that for every one of those, there are state and local requirements that parks are interested in trying to comply with to make sure that we are in sync with the locality so that we're providing a service that's not only benefiting the park visitor, but also benefiting the local community appropriately. And that drove an awful lot of our work last year as we developed what at that point in time we were calling adaptive operations recovery programs, how we would pivot from our normal operations to address the COVID-19 epidemic, ultimately become a pandemic as it emerged. One of the key things that we were concerned about was, we didn't know a lot about the disease and how it would transmit. And in many of our parks, such as Yellowstone, where Michelle cut her teeth, they're fairly remote locations. There's not a lot of access to healthcare there. The potential for something like an outbreak to occur in a park and to impact a variety of not only visitors, but our employees, and potentially really slow down the ability to provide any sort of service, but also overwhelm local hospitals was a key concern for park superintendents. And they were juggling that need as they tried to determine what they were going to be able to do. How do they manage the staff in the park as well as the visitors coming to the park to prevent that type of transmission? And the other big piece to that is really the community relationship as well. And so we were not only dealing with how do we manage local transmission in the park, but also what is our role in helping to manage that for the local community. And so when we looked at communities that may have been significantly impacted, in particular by COVID. For example, the communities around Grand Canyon that were significantly impacted. Our superintendents were really cognizant of what they needed to do to work with the community to make that happen. And for many of you as tour operators and bus companies coming into parks, you recognize that is part of your DNA, because you're not just coming to the park, but you're also visiting those gateway communities and the communities between parks. And so you too had to deal with that. So that really helped craft the Park Service's position on how they were going to manage. Given that patchwork of types of parks, locality, local and state requirements, we did and we continue to give our superintendents a significant amount of authority to try to make smart decisions on how to manage that transmissibility and risk. And so last year there was a risk matrix that superintendents used to try to determine, and took in all those factors to try to determine how they could manage things. And ultimately it came down to a number of key items that they had to deal with. Was things like, how do we manage sizes of groups? In CDC last year issued, and many states adopted, some limitations in group size, 10 persons for non-essential groups, and then 50 persons for multiple groups. And I checked before I came on here, and many of the states are still utilizing those sorts of kind of criteria around how many people to be in a location. And that drove a lot of the thinking by superintendents. How do we manage an overlook and keep that group size down to 10 or to a reasonable number? How do we apply that on our shuttle buses or to the buses that are coming in? And that drove a lot of their decision making. The other big piece that it was critical, and it's sometimes hard to understand, is that one of the key things that drives our ability to provide services in parks is our ability to have enough employees to provide the services. And one of the kind of pinch points for us has been, and will continue to be, the congregate housing of seasonal rangers that we bring on. We double or triple the number of staff that we have in most parks during the summer, or whatever the height of the season is, to address the need to provide visitor services, law enforcement, interpretation, all of those sorts of things. And the same is true of all of our concessioners who draw from a huge seasonal population. Most of those individuals are in what we call congregate or cohort housing, dormitory housing, if you will. And having the ability for easier transmission, particularly in sleeping arrangements, was really significant and limited our ability to staff up last year, because we were limited to only one person per bedroom, which would never happen. And often it's 2, sometimes 3 and 4 people. And so not only did we have our need to kind of help manage social distancing of people and that sort of stuff, but we had limited staff. And so we saw ourselves having to limit services, not only because we wanted the social distance and make sure that we were managing retail space or restaurants well and in accordance with CDC and state and local guidance, but we didn't even have the staff to do that. And so that drove quite a bit of the thinking last year. As a result of that, we did have kind of a superintendents making decisions. In some cases, they were varied in terms of how they had to approach things. So that was 2020. The strong emphasis was try to keep what we could open. And we knew that, and continue to know, that visitors being able to come to parks and be able to have that park experience is really important for their mental health as well as physical health. And so we were strongly emphasized by the secretary to keep what we could open. So we come into 2021 with some lessons learned and some slightly different approaches to things that I think is ultimately going to help us to move kind of forward and do more than we were able to do last year. I'm optimistic about that, but I think that that's what we're seeing as an organization. The first is we know more about the disease than we did last year. I don't know if anybody knows this, but we actually have a cadre of approximately over 50 U.S. Public Health Service officers that are stationed within the Park Service system, and they provide us ongoing support on the disease, disease transmission. They do testing and investigations for disease. Some of you may have experienced it even in your bus tour operations. And they've helped us to understand the disease better. And so last year, there was a lot of concern about surfaces. You need to clean everything, make sure all surfaces are clean. Bathrooms were a huge kind of crux part for us, because we knew a lot of visitors were going to need to use restrooms, and there was concern about that. We have less concern about that this year. There's knowledge that the disease doesn't transmit quite as much on surfaces as we thought. It's really all about people and distancing. And so that's helping us to understand that may open some things up. We also have some new tools, and we're looking at ways that they can be used creatively. The primary one that we're hopeful on is things like testing, recognizing that whether it's a bus company or a lodging operation, housing for concessioners, it may be possible for us to do testing as a means to monitor if there is disease, and that can help us perhaps do more than we were able to last year and get us to be able to open more services, provide more employees in the park, but ultimately will provide us the ability to provide better services. We're working very closely with our public health service partners and CDC to understand what the limitations of that would be and what the expectations would be around that. We also know more about the ideas of quarantining in advance and isolating people so that people can travel in a pod or a cohort. That may be a way to help manage things. We're actively working at what does, we have a new administration with a mask mandate, which applies to indoor settings in all federal facilities. So we know that unlike last year where there was kind of a wrestling match around mask wearing, whether we were going to do it in the federal facilities or in the restaurants that were operated by the concessioners, there's some consistency around that this year, which is going to be very helpful for us to help manage parks and limit, at least in one way, having that mask helps us to reduce risk. It wasn't a tool that we had before. In the outdoor setting, many of you have probably seen that the idea is that if you're in close contact with somebody, you wear a mask, but if you're more than 6 feet away, you're climbing a mountain, we're not going to be expecting mask wearing in those environments. But that's a tool that we have now that we didn't have before that we'll be able to utilize. The other is looking at executive order requirements around social distancing and how that might be managed. And so we are still actively looking at state and local requirements, which I checked before I came on, are still very varied, from 25% occupancies to 50 people to 75 people to 25 people. And states, those state and local requirements are things that are going to still be a factor in superintendents' decisions on how they're going to manage things. But we're also looking to provide some more consistent guidance around kind of the state of affairs for CDC, which is 6 foot distancing is what we'd like to see. Masking helps as well. And how can we integrate that and overlay that against the state and local requirements that may have been limiting things before and that might not be necessary moving forward. That is all very dynamic. The administration has only been in office for less than 30 days, and we are a bureaucracy, so it takes us a little while to take that guidance through executive orders and ultimately through the Office of Management and Budget and down to the Department of Interior and ultimately to the Park Service, craft guidance that we can then get out to our field superintendents so that they can manage. But I'm part of a task group that's actively working on that to make sure that we can prepare guidelines that are science-based, provide good ideas for how superintendents can manage, but also provide them the flexibility to address what they need to relative to state and local requirements, and also manage their own unique requirements for the park. Ultimately, we're hoping a little bit more consistent, a little bit more ability to use masks and other things to open up parks a little bit more than maybe we had last year. And we do have a challenge because we do have such diversity in our park environments and state and localities. And we're recognizing that. I think some of the additional speakers are going to talk to some of the things that are happening in particular parks. What I'm trying to do as a Washington office program is to bring some of those park superintendents and their decision-making and insights that they've gathered by talking to you into a group discussion to talk about what are really good kind of baseline sideboards that we are seeing that would be working everywhere, so that we can give them kind of that guideline that they can then craft their own program around and talk to you as bus operators about what you might be doing, how that fits in there. We expect that ultimately will give us a little bit more consistency. There's probably still going to be issues where the locality has a specific requirement that the park feels are necessary to honor, that are going to create an environment that there may be a difference between what happens at Yosemite and what happens at Yellowstone, but at least understanding kind of the baseline as to why we're doing it and what are social distancing issues, or how could testing be applied in a bus environment, or the podding concept, and how can we apply that and get all of our superintendents thinking thoughtfully around that broader concept, so that when you come into a park, you're getting kind of a fairly consistent approach. And if it's not consistent, you understand specifically why, and it's been well articulated. That's really our position. We have a meeting with the Park Service leadership, most of the largest park superintendents and the leadership in the Park Service next Monday, to have that conversation and then be able to report out to you all about what that looks like. And I'll stop there, Lisa. Hopefully that's enough kind of groundwork. I think we're going to hear a lot of really specific examples in our ongoing conversations that I helped to respond to. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Kurt. We appreciate all of the work that you're putting into this. I know it's no easy task to not only deal with COVID, but just like you said, the vast differences amongst all of the different parks and sites that the National Park Service manages. Michelle, you and Marco have served on a working group for tour operators with Yellowstone officials to discuss their COVID adjustments, and particularly, I think, the limiting of the group size in alignment with the public health guidelines there. Can you tell us about that issue and the progress that's been made with the Yellowstone officials?
Sure, Marco, I guess I'll take it. Yes, we had a small coalition of couple industry leaders and tour operators that we were lucky enough to get the superintendent on the phone and discuss not only our issues, but to see what theirs are moving forward. I mean, we all want to get back on the road again. And a lot of it was, I think, an education, as far as I'm not sure they really knew what we as tour operators actually could provide to them as a safe environment to actually come into the park. I mean, we know exactly where our people have been. We tell them where to go. We tell them when to get off the bus. So to break them out of our pod, let's say, that Kurt just mentioned, and put them on smaller vehicles, for example, to get in the park, I think would not be a good thing going into their particular park. But they have their challenges there, as Kurt said, between the public health officials, and in Yellowstone's case, it was from multiple states even. So it'll be interesting to see what 2021 is going to look like, because at this point, I think the housing issue that Kurt actually talked about is going to really impact what certain openings of attractions, or Canyon, I hear, for the dining room and etc., is going to even be able to open this year. So though we are hoping that maybe some of these could be changed going into this after the summer months, if things get better with COVID. I'm not sure that's even possible. That's a question for Kurt. But it was very nice to see that the superintendent actually understood some of what we do and how we plan 12 to 18 months out. And that I don't think they knew. We don't care if there's some rules to come into the park, because we have no problem with that. We've got our passengers on the bus, and we can let them know where they could go and what stops to make and stuff like that. So hopefully we'll be able to work together. And I found that he was very receptive to some of the things that we said, as far as being able to at least bring our buses into the park. So we're just hoping moving forward that we can all get back to some kind of normality here sooner rather than later.
Definitely. Marco, do you have any comments to add on Yellowstone? And also, I think you participated in a similar working group with the Grand Canyon. Maybe tell us about that situation as well.
Sure. Good morning, Lisa, and hello from sunny Grand Canyon. I appreciate Kurt's comment on the bureaucracy. I think that as an operator, when dealing with the national parks in the past, often there were two questions that came to mind, and that was, how can they and why don't they instead? And so sometimes that's been accompanied by a little bit of head shaking. And so for this part with Grand Canyon, there's a lot of good news though. So as I think everybody knows, when the park shut down last year in April, Grand Canyon had then reopened for a brief moment, and they did that with modified operations in June. And so there were two key provisions in this. You had to submit a COVID plan, and your maximum group size could not be more than 10, which included the driver and the guide. So now this period of reopening was very short-lived, and on June 10, Grand Canyon then paused the access again. And so that was for the CUA holders. So again, you have to have a CUA and you have to operate at that point. As far as I know, no major tour operator had actually submitted plans for the modified operations at that point in time in June. And the simple reason was that nobody was really operating in any larger fashion, and you only had 6 days to get your documents in. And so at that point, most of us are not holding or are having a COA, but we're not holding a current COA because we haven't submitted COVID mitigation plans. And so then in September, the park allows some resumption for backpacking and day hiking, but the general pause is still in effect. And then we fast forward to November, and on November 30, we all get the new notice, and the new notice says, we're currently not accepting new COA applications. We're keeping the 10 passenger maximum, which again includes the driver and the guide, so you can only put eight folks really in your van, if you will. And so at that point, everybody gets really nervous, and you can't renew or request your new COA because, again, most of us didn't have operation in 2020, and so we weren't able to get the plans essentially in. So now it's come full circle. It's a big issue for the industry at this point because we rely so heavily on the national parks. And so we've sold these itineraries, which include Grand Canyon, and some of them are 12, 14, 16, 18 months on the market. We all have created these protocols, the safety protocols in the operating plans that Michelle was talking about. So a lot of time and effort went into that to get them into the market and get them established. And we desperately need the national parks for some recovery in 21 because we do, I know we do. So we've raised that with USTOA in December, and so did a lot of other operators. And that was on the heels of the Yellowstone conversation that we've had and that Michelle and I were part of. And then USTOA, along with some of the other trade associations, reach out to the Arizona senators. There's some contact with the Department of Interior. In mid-December, then we're having the first phone call with Doug Lenz, who is the chief commercial officer for Grand Canyon. And these initial calls have now developed into a working group, and Grand Canyon has agreed to accept CUA applications. So we're now able to put our CUA applications in for 2021. The applications are essentially approved conditionally, which means they're in limbo until the restrictions are lifted. But the good news is you don't have to wait until the restrictions are lifted to put your CUA application in. And Grand Canyon have also communicated a plan that they really want to open on or about May 21 fully. And that then means access for the coaches. And so that also affects the 10 or the 8 passenger minimum in a way you want to look at. And so we've been really fortunate having that conversation with Grand Canyon. Naturally, we all understand that there's the situation of the now, and there's the situation down the line. And so as the infection rates change and as the vaccination rates change, I think we all hope to be in a much better position by then. And so as far as Grand Canyon goes, really, as I said earlier, some of the head shaking has gone away. And so we're in a much better place now.
So can you comment, and perhaps Michelle, you can too, on how are you selling into the future with some of the unknowns, with some of these still unknown logistical issues with those two parks as examples, as well as any others that you're dealing with?
Well, I'll answer for myself is I'm crossing my fingers here. So we're going to punt, so obviously national parks are in almost all of my itineraries. So If it is unable to open with the motor coach, we will go to plan B and figure out another way to actually try to get them in the park safely, or we will substitute it for a state park or something else on the way. But again, our passengers that are booking these tours for this year, and if they run, they're going to want to go into that park, but we do have a stipulation that it depends upon if it's open or not for group travel. So.
Yeah, the access to the national parks is critical. So there is the fact of operators holding bookings that were moved forward, for example, from the 20 season. So folks who may have purchased this in 18 or 19 for a 20 trip, and for one reason or another, they've elected to go in 20 now, hoping that they can go in 20. And so for a good part, let's say for the February, March, April departures, we've had to suspend trips. And so we weren't actually able to run them simply because there are death by paper cut, if you will, right? So there are too many of these issues that sit on top of each other. And so then that's where these conversations are really so important for us, because we need the ability to plan accordingly and communicate this to our guests. And so that's also on the van side. In the conversations we've had with Yellowstone and with Grand Canyon, we've also tried to, with the COVID mitigation plans and all the procedures in place, a little bit to the bubbles that Kurt talked about. We've been trying to speak to the fact that we are coming in with a set of guests that we've already vetted. We know where they're from. We can contact trace them. We can tell them essentially for every single step of their journey while they go through the park, more or less what to do in a nice way. And so there is a significant benefit in having us, for example, as part of this. We also consider this an access issue, I would say, because a lot of our guests are seniors. And so you could say, well, why don't they drive there? And the answer to this is a lot of them can't. And so they may not have the means, they don't have a car. And so there are all these these pieces that come together. So it's the access that's really important with the bookings, but then also facts of sustainability and traffic management that we want to talk about in the working groups. And that's why this has been a really good experience. And I hope we're able to continue this on a larger level for the other parks as well.
And that's a nice segue to ask Dennis, how are these issues affecting the charter companies that are dealing with providing transportation to many different types of tour operators and groups to a number of national parks?
Sure. It's definitely impacting business with motor coach operators throughout the country. And I'd like to just reiterate some of the points that Marco and Michelle made that are exactly our bullet points as well. I think the biggest issue is the uncertainty that it creates for the tour operators and motor coach operators. I went on a kind of a research mission when Lisa asked me to sit on this panel, and thank you very much, Lisa, and all of our friends at Go West, thank you. But it really creates some real issues because these tour operators are coming to the motor coach companies going, okay, we want to have a picture stop here and a picture stop there, but what do you know currently about how we're going to get in, how much it's going to cost if we need the CUAs? So those are all uncertainty issues. The full size motor coaches, if we get down to 8 passengers with a tour guide and a driver, not feasible. And I have no idea if tour operators are going to have the ability to even recoup. And what it also causes, you talk about, well, we'll just take a bunch of vans. It's popping up everywhere. It's creating a cottage industry of van operators on the outskirts of these national parks, which is even a little bit more dangerous than having a controlled motor coach go into the park. Now you've got somebody that went out and, I love the companies, but leased 15 vans from Hertz and threw a couple drivers in there, and they're not operating under the same compliances that motor coaches are, and possibly do not have the same cleaning procedures in place. The other issue with the vans is finding drivers. Our driver pools are significantly reduced over the last year. because some of these people have gone elsewhere, found different work. So driver pools are way down. The added cost to everyone, and also being unable to accurately advise customers about access is a huge issue. I mean, I have a lot of people such as Jan Kuzel that's on this conference right now. Hello, Jan, and many others that rely on us for information, and we have uncertain information. So there's confusion in every effort. And I researched with Bronwyn Wilson, the president and CEO of the International Motor Coach Group, and also Peter Pantuso, both, he's the president of ABA, as you all know, good friends of mine. And they came up with some of the same points, that this is huge issues that we want to make sure that Kurt and all the national parks people might be able to help understand that motor coaches are the solution to a lot of these problems. We have a group inside the coach. We have a restroom inside the coach. We have cleaning procedures daily and before coaches ever would leave points of pickup that are in place. We have control over all of those groups, and we give access to a lot of people that would, like Lisa mentioned, be unable, and Marco mentioned, would be unable to travel in these national parks. Peter Pantuso gave me a couple of good points about adding the control, and most of our customers have senior citizens and students, and these people are part of a group that are probably more highly vaccinated than any other portion of our age groups, which is, I think, is important to know. Then there's a lot of uncertainty about uniformity between the parks. This park does that park does this. We'd sure like to see more uniformity so that we can pass on to motor coach operators and in turn to their customers, our customers throughout the areas. Talking to the series operators like Michelle and Marco and some of the other big operators, Globus and Taux and everything, they're all finding the same issues of, okay, now we have to hire 4 vans to take our 34 passenger group in. And they're coming to the bus company. Well, the bus company's going, where are we going to house these drivers? Where are we going to get the vans? And at times for La Bus, my company, we may have 20 buses in Yellowstone at one time. That's pretty important to know for tour operators. Are going, okay, where are we going to get our vans from? They're coming to us for answers, and we don't have all of those answers. I have had a lot of encouragement from Julie from Yellowstone, and I believe her last name is, you all probably are aware of her. She's given me a lot of direction on what might be happening and what direction we may be coming, and she's works, of course, for CAM. There's many challenges early this year, and the tour operators, some of them think that they're kind of getting the short end of the stick. So together, top of the list of vacations being these national parks, we can't substitute anything for Yellowstone and many others. Another huge issue is Yosemite with the length of the motor coaches. We've got a group from, say, Czechoslovakia that has 35 people on board, and we've got a 40-foot coach on it. We can't get in Yosemite because it's 39 11-inch is the longest you can have. So there's not very many coaches that are in that length. So that creates other problems. I've got a couple of alternatives. It was clear that the motor coach restrictions were basically coming from local and area health officials. And a lot of people in the tour industry is pointing fingers at the national parks going, why won't they open it up? Well, there's a combination where we need to invite these other people into these conversations. And that's a bit of what's happening in the motor coach end. And maybe we should turn it back over to you, and maybe you can open up for questions or questions that you may have of me. And thank you very much again.
Yeah, I was going to see if, Kurt, I didn't know if you had wanted to address any of that at this point, or if not, I have another question for Michelle and Marco about international visitors.
Sure, I think these are all really good points, and I'm looking forward to having those conversations. I think Dennis's point about state and localities I made reference to several times, and it did and does drive a lot of the decision making within the parks, because our park superintendents are city neighbors essentially to these localities, and they're sensitive to overwhelming those localities and honoring some of their decision making as well. And I did look, the closest I could come to in terms of a summary was an AARP site before I came on, and it is just all over the map still. And so when you look at somebody traveling from doing the Grand Circle from Bryce and Zion to Grand Canyon and around, you're in 3 or 4 states that all have different limitations on group size. And so it's challenging not only for the Gateway community, but you to have to manage all of those. And some of that we're not going to be able to fix, but we can at least see what those issues are. I think the conversation around group size, whether it's still relevant or not, given the fact that there's podding and other factors that may be just as relevant now, is the conversation that we want to have with our superintendents. The CDC guidance is less structured around group size now, and it talks a lot more to a 6-foot social distancing limit. And so it may be more of a conversation of how can we safely maintain that 6-foot distancing limit. And despite the fact that even the bus tour group may be safe and not carrying any disease, you're also interacting with everybody else that's on the overlook when you unload the 30 people out onto that overlook. And so we're concerned about making sure we can maintain social distancing in that environment. Ideas on how you might be able to help us do that, so that there's not extensive congregation at one location at one point in time. I think those are really great conversations to have, because I think those are the challenges our superintendents are working through. How do we manage groups? How can we keep control? And I think a lot of this 10-foot or this 10-person and bus size stuff was superintendent's concerns last year about overloading particular debarkation points. And if we can figure out ways jointly to do that creatively, I think our superintendents are very interested. We know people are coming to parks, and we know people want to be on buses. We are conscious of the fact that between vaccinations and just people that have had illness and now feel that they can travel again, I know we're going to see a lot of pent-up demand, and we want to be ready to respond, because we know that not only is it an issue in terms of your industry, but it's an issue in terms of our being able to provide visitation for the population that wants to come to parks and ought to be able to, if we can do it safely. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And just to remind everybody, if you have questions for the panelists, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and we'll get started with that in just a moment. But I did want to ask Michelle and Marco, either one of you want to comment on just any other unique issues related to international visitors, specifically, whether that be independent or the fact that they are even more so sometimes than domestic group tour passengers. They're visiting so many more parks, perhaps in one trip, because they're coming into the United States and they want to see it all at one time. Any other issues that specific to international visitors that you want to address?
So I'll have a first go at it, and then Michelle can improve upon that. I'm sure she'll have good things to add. Now, from an international perspective, let's keep in mind that there are entry requirement questions currently into the US, for example, right? So, and people may have to be tested. They will have, right now, they need to be tested before they come. And then there's the question of what happens between the testing and the vaccine passport conversation that's happening simultaneously. So again, people are coming in, and then through a vetting mechanism, they become part of that group that now goes out into the parks and forms this pod that Kirk was talking about. So that's the first part of the mechanics of managing the visitation as they go through their itinerary. But I think more importantly, it's also to think about the long lead time that, for example, international group travel typically takes, right? So a lot of these itineraries are sold with a 2 or 3 year lead time. So a lot of the clients overseas are working on their 22, 23 programs at this point in time. So it's all about the ability to plan for these itineraries. And yes, a lot of our domestic groups, Lisa, for example, visit a number of parks. So we have a program that goes through 14 national parks. And so it's really important to think about this also in the overall construct of the packaged operation, and that I called this earlier the death by paper cut, right? So that we need the security for all the different parks at the same time. And we also need the ability to really understand what those requirements are. And I know that it's difficult for the parks. We know this through the conversations, to have all their requirements, but we also need to know what's going on at any particular point in time. And so through these working groups, I think there's been a lot more transparency when it comes to the rules and how they are developed. And so we need that for the rest of the parks as well. I know there's a question in the chat about, who else has 10 passenger requirements? And the short answer is, I don't know. And so very often we hold a CUA and we find out, and or it's hearsay. One of my colleagues will call me and say, have you heard that this park now has a 10 passenger maximum? And so that's where, again, these working relationships with the National Park Service are extremely important for us.
That's a good point.
I totally agree. And I think, Marco, because you do more international inbound, there is also a requirement that whatever is on their itinerary they have to do, or they get their money has to be returned. Isn't that correct?
Well, there are, depending on the market, so where guests are from, there are significant rules in place. If you look at the UK and the APTA, or you look at EU regulations for this, again, it's the packaged operation of trips. And there can be substantial damages that passengers are entitled to if we're not performing the itineraries as they were originally outlined or as they were promised. And so that's where it's a compounding effect of putting all these things on top, right? So we have to refund guests who are not getting certain services. And then there's that 10 passenger van conversation that Dennis brought up a little bit earlier, where then we're also suffering commercial consequences because now we're needing to include this somehow. And we're breaking the bubble. We're putting people into multiple vans and nobody wins. And so I think it's through some of these working group conversations, it's been also really helpful for the parks. I feel sometimes to go back to their local stakeholders and explain that a little bit better, because that's where a lot of these intricacies of the industry are not easily understood.
And I want to continue on that thought as well, for the fact that if there's one positive that this pandemic has brought out, is the fact that we're having these conversations right now. There has been no consistency within the National Park Service when it comes to group tour business. And one park can be completely different rules than the next park. So it would be nice to be able to at least have some consistency, especially when Marco says he has 14 different national parks on one itinerary, and every superintendent might have different rules. So it's been difficult. Some have CUAs, some don't have CUAs. It would be nice to have more of a central location to be able to find some of that information. And I think when Mark and I were having these conversations with Yellowstone, that they really didn't understand the group tour market as well, and how just being able to have those conversations with the superintendents was helpful going forward, that they understood that, that we have these people captured on our bus for a 7 to 10 day tour. And if there's certain places they don't want us to stop, or if there's certain things places they do want us to go, that we can actually include that on our tours. So hopefully Kurt will be able to round up some of these, and whether it's a working group or another advisory board or something like that, to try to change this industry so that the tour buses that come into the park are helping the parks as opposed to hurting the parks.
Yeah, good point. And Kurt, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I think I share the difficulties that you have. We are, as I mentioned before, not a monolithic group, and there's differences operationally, there's differences in locality, and I think having conversations, representing or knowing that superintendents have concerns about, the potential for spread in their park community. How can you help us in that way? And the idea of the 10-person on a vehicle piece is understandable if perhaps not really practical or, getting the effect that you want, because you've got 10, the ideal is you only got 10 people, and the potential for spread, is probably not as great as if you had 50 people. And I do know that superintendents worry about, unloading large groups of individuals, even though your pod may be fine, those people that you may be interacting with people that may not be fine. And then you create a bubble of people that may be ill, or, and so there's that concern. How can we maintain, the intent is to try to do social distancing of 6 feet. And so if you have ideas on how to help parks manage that, whether it's, pulling into a spot and, there's already a bus there, that means you move on, or you unload a certain number of people, trying to manage those sorts of things, I think are going to be solutions that superintendents are going to be very interested in. And if they're common solutions, until we overlay those state and local requirements or uniqueness of a park that may be create some sort of special need, I think we can create those consistencies from park to park, which I would love to do, because I know it's a hardship. And of course, you are also dealing with the fact that you may be going to Rushmore, but also Custer State Park, and Rushmore is federal, Custer is state. And so, how do you manage those two? Because one could potentially be different, even if we tried to be consistent. So this is a great conversation for me to try to understand that. And I do see some of the, an intended good solution has has unintended consequences that are, we want to daylight to, I think you're already daylighting to your superintendents you're talking to, but daylight to the larger community to make sure that we can kind of find these sideboards. And again, I have no guarantees that you're not going to see inconsistencies because of the state and local requirements, or, Yellowstone's a through park and Yosemite's a drive into the valley park. And maybe there are issues between the two of those that aren't going to be able to be common. But having that dialogue amongst superintendents can be very helpful, I think.
And I think, Kurt, that's where those conversations with the parks directly and with the superintendents have been really powerful, because once you have the ability to sit down and spend a little bit of time and look at an issue in a more differentiated fashion, and you say, look, this is a group of 15 people that comes in on this vehicle, and they've been together. Are you really telling me you want to take the 15 people off and to put 10 in one and 5 in the other, and now mix them with 5 other ones? Does that make sense to you? And we know that in the end, there are good real world solutions once you really have a little bit of time to go through some of these examples with specificity. And the overlook question, so I know that Yellowstone last year had the biggest visitation, and I think in 50 years or so. And so we know that there are lots of people, but to the point earlier, I think Dennis brought this up. We are a solution to a lot of these crowd management type questions, because we come as a packaged operation also with the folks on the coaches, right? And so, yes, there needs to be discipline within the operator community, but we have travel directors, tour guides aboard the coaches by and large. And so there is an ability to instruct guests, help them understand, and then also work with the parks on where does the coach really stop? How are we augmenting the current system within the park, rather than being required to take the folks off the coach and put them on something else? And so it's the Zion conversation, it's other conversations all rolled into one. And so I hope that over the course of the next few months, as we go through this together, we have the ability to go through some of these pieces a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, I think that's great. To be honest with you, having this dialogue, not just, at the start of the season, that looks to be another, unfortunately, COVID-related season, but on an ongoing basis. Michelle made mention to, this kind of concept of a work group. I think over the last 2 years, there has been a developed work group, although it kind of stalled. There was a lot of conversation about CUAs a year or so ago, and then that kind of got shut down. And I'd like to continue that dialogue, because I think having that ongoing conversation as opposed to the spits and starts is really valuable too, because we learn more about you, you learn more about us. I did want to mention, we are, another huge piece to our interests are in being flexible and nimble. It's difficult because you all have to plan ahead. The parks are, we don't know what July is going to look like. Even, in the last couple of days, we hear more vaccinations are going to be available. So it could be that, we're talking about something that may be different in May than it is going to be in August. And we want to be able to pivot as quickly as possible to provide the most opportunity. The problem is that that pivot may not be able to be accounted for in your business plan because you've got to make decisions now. And so we're trying to look ahead at what might be there and plan to that as well, knowing that it could be different. I mean, we could have another COVID variant that closes down, the entire Navajo reservation again, like it did last year, right? And we're stuck. So we just don't know what we don't know. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, this has been a very, very healthy dialogue, and thank you all so much for your knowledge and input and willingness to continue the conversation. Julie, I know we have a couple of questions. I think we have maybe a time for one or two.
We sure do. Let's try and rapid fire these with as much detail as possible, if you guys don't mind. The first question that we got from an attendee, Sonia, before we started this session is if there's any information on rate changes going into 2022. Any information on the cost to go to national parks in the future?
So I guess there are several pieces to this. So for those that have commercial use authorizations, there's a commercial use authorization fee. We don't expect any significant changes in that. I know there's strong interest, and it's a topic for an entirely another conversation about CUA consistency across the service, which we don't have at this point in time. So there's that piece, and I honestly can't speak to commercial entrance fees. That's not my area of expertise. I don't see the Park Service making drastic changes in fee structures at a point in time when there's so much other uncertainty in what's going on.
Thank you, Kurt. Another question, there's some rumor going around that rental cars might be an issue in the market because rental car companies aren't able to get cars from the manufacturers to their fleets. Is this something that any of you have heard also? That rental cars could be an issue getting into national parks or renting in general because of fleet limitations?
I think most of us provide commercial tours here, so we probably don't rent vehicles.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, let's try and squeeze one more in here before we wrap up. Is it possible for the national park websites for each specific park to display the current limitation on group sizes? While they provide alerts in effect, there's no mention of group limitations, which is becoming kind of a challenge.
That sounds like one for me.
Please,
I would
Kurt.
say that seems to be something that we ought to be striving to do, that you as operators should know what the limitations are. We should be transparent in that information. And I will definitely take that back as messaging that, if we're going to set up a program where we're going to ask for certain things, that we should be clear about it. It may not be on the front page, but at least a click or two into it as to where information on group tours or whatever is residing on that park website, it should be available. I agree.
And updated, Kurt.
And updated. You are correct. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Kurt.
And I think one point that a lot of tour operators that I'm getting and motor coach operators is they're still asking the same question they had on their mind at the start of this panel. Do I need a CUA to get in? And as a bus operator, we're telling them, hey, our motor coach will go in. Yellowstone charges $300. That's what we're doing. So there's a lot of uncertainty from many of these tour operators, not necessarily the series operators, but we need uniformity and share that with everyone like Lisa did maybe 2 years ago with that information sheet.
So on CUAs and the need for CUAs, there was significant input from the industry on our attempt to issue a service-wide CUA program a year or so ago. And so we were told to stand down on that. and we've put a moratorium on any new CUAs until that's lifted. And so the parks that had CUA programs still have CUA programs. The parks that don't have CUA programs should not be instituting any new CUA programs. That's kind of the current Park Service policy. And we can, as we move forward, we would like to reconstitute that conversation about CUA needs within the Park Service, because we have a legitimate statutory obligation to make sure that there's an authorization for folks coming into parks. But I think that's probably not going to be happening until later this year and after we get out of this COVID situation.
Thank you, Kurt. And with that final thought, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this session. Thank you very much to Kurt, Dennis, Michelle, Marco, and Lisa for presenting on this topic. And thank you, audience, for joining. We do have one final webinar today at 2 p.m. with our tour operator panel, and we encourage you to register and be a part of the conversation. You can do so on our Education Week page on the Go West Summit website. Thank you all again, and we will see you later this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.